Watch your tone. The flight attendant snarled his fist, clenching and unclenching like a predator preparing to strike. 10-year-old Isaiah Taylor froze, confusion washing over his face, as the apple juice he'd politely requested became the trigger for an adult's inexplicable rage. The man loomed over him, his uniform once a symbol of safety and authority, now transformed into something menacing. Isaiah's heartbeat quickened, the roar of the engine suddenly distant compared to the blood rushing in his ears. He couldn't understand what he'd done wrong. What the flight attendant didn't see was the woman in seat 1A, Federal Judge Gabriela Mendoza, her dark eyes narrowing as she registered every microaggression, every shift in body language, her hand already reaching for the call button. Nor could he know that the boy's father, Dr. Marcus Taylor, wasn't just any surgeon, but a former military trauma specialist who'd sworn an oath to protect the vulnerable, an oath that extended far beyond operating rooms. The flight attendant thought he was establishing dominance over a child who dared question him. In reality, he was igniting a chain reaction that would dismantle not just his career, but an entire corporate culture built on unchecked prejudice. If you believe no child should be punched into silence, join our channel and hit subscribe before this story begins. Brian Reynolds adjusted his uniform tie with practiced precision, the same motion he'd performed nearly every day for the past 12 years as a flight attendant for Altitude Airlines. At 38, his once enthusiastic smile had hardened into something more perfunctory, a professional mask that rarely reached his eyes anymore. Today, that mask felt particularly heavy as he surveyed the first-class cabin of Flight 2703 from Chicago to Atlanta. His fingers brushed against the silver wings pinned to his chest, the emblem he'd once coveted with such passion when he'd first joined the airline fresh out of hospitality school. Back then, the prestige of working first-class routes had seemed the pinnacle of success. Now it felt like an endless parade of entitled passengers, whose demands grew more unreasonable with each passing year. Coffee service ready in 5, called Melissa, the junior flight attendant working economy today. Reynolds nodded without turning his attention, caught by something unusual in row 2. A child, a young black boy in seat 2B, sat alone in the premium cabin, an unaccompanied minor tag hanging around his neck. Reynolds felt his jaw tighten. In his experience, unaccompanied minors belonged in economy, where the crew could keep a closer eye on them, not taking up valuable space in first class, where business travelers paid premium prices for peace and quiet. Someone at the gate had clearly made an error, but it was too late to rectify it now, with boarding complete and the door closed. Another diversity initiative, he muttered under his breath, arranging champagne flutes on his service cart, with more force than necessary. It wasn't the first time he'd seen the airline bend its own rules in ways that, in his view, diminished the exclusivity of the first-class experience. Reynolds had grown up in a small town in northern Illinois, the son of a factory worker who'd lost his job when manufacturing moved overseas. His father's bitterness had seeped into their home life, manifesting in tirades about how certain people were getting advantages, while hardworking Americans like them struggled. As a child, Reynolds had absorbed these views without questioning them. As an adult, he'd learned to keep them carefully contained, behind a professional veneer most of the time. "Is that a child in first?" he whispered to Melissa as she passed, unaccompanied. "Gate agent upgraded him," she replied with a shrug. "Said he was extremely well-behaved at check-in." "Sweet kid, actually," Reynolds grunted non-committally. Sweet or not, the boy didn't fit his mental image of a first-class passenger. His presence felt like another small erosion of standards in an industry that had once prided itself on exclusivity and was now chasing social approval at every turn. As he worked his way down the aisle offering pre-flight beverages, Reynolds kept glancing back at the boy in 2B. The child sat perfectly still, hands folded in his lap, gazing out the window with obvious excitement. His clothes were neat, expensive-looking. Reynolds had seen enough wealthy families to recognize the markers of privilege, which only irritated him more. Some people's children got handed advantages his own family could never have afforded. When he reached row 2, Reynolds deliberately skipped over the boy, serving the businessman in 2C first. "Anything to drink before takeoff, sir?" he asked, his tone noticeably warmer than it had been moments before. "Just water, thanks," the man replied, without looking up from his laptop. Reynolds placed a napkin and water on the passenger's tray, then turned as if to move on. The boy in 2B looked up expectantly, clearly having been taught to wait his turn. Reynolds paused, giving the child a cursory glance. "Juice or water?" he asked, his voice flat, already reaching for a plastic cup rather than the glass tumblers he'd offered other passengers. "May I have apple juice, please?" the boy asked, his voice clear but soft, respectful. Reynolds nodded stiffly, poured a half cup of juice and set it down without a napkin before moving on. A small, petty omission that no one would call him out for, but which gave him a momentary sense of having maintained some invisible boundary. As he continued his preparations, Reynolds felt the weight of the long day ahead. 6 flights in the past 3 days, a dispute with his landlord over rising rent, and now a child in first class who would probably make unnecessary demands throughout the flight. His shoulders tensed as he heard the telltale chime of the call button from row 2. Already, he thought, it's starting already. And yet beneath his irritation lurked a different emotion, a strange discomfort with his own reaction. Why did this polite child provoke such hostility? The question surfaced briefly before he buried it under the weight of accumulated resentment and stress. Brian Reynolds' fist connected with Isaiah Taylor's jaw in a moment that seemed to stretch and distort time itself. The sound knuckles against bone cartilage giving way cut through the cabin's white noise like a gunshot. Isaiah's head snapped back violently, his small body lifting partially from the seat with the force of the impact before crumpling against the window. The metallic taste of blood flooded his mouth as the world around him fractured into disconnected sensations, the sharp crack of his jaw dislocating, the hot wetness spreading down his chin, the sudden ringing in his ears that muffled everything else. For the briefest moment, Isaiah felt nothing but confusion, his brain unable to process that an adult, a flight attendant meant to keep passengers safe, had struck him. Then came the pain radiating from his jaw in white-hot pulses that made his vision swim and his stomach heave. A high, thin whimper escaped his throat, the only sound he could produce, as his broken jaw refused to work. The plastic cup of apple juice that Reynolds had been holding crashed to the floor, the amber liquid splashing across the aisle carpet and the shoes of nearby passengers. Isaiah watched it spread with a strange detachment, his mind desperately seeking anything to focus on, besides the agony consuming his face. Blood dripped steadily now, spattering his blue button-down shirt in a constellation of dark red stars soaking into the collar and spreading across the fabric. He tried to raise a hand to his face, but couldn't coordinate the movement, his body in shock, trembling with adrenaline and trauma. The businessman in 2C leapt to his feet, laptop clattering to the floor. "Jesus Christ! What the hell are you doing?" he shouted, moving instinctively to shield Isaiah from further attack. His movement broke the frozen tableau that had gripped the cabin in the seconds following the assault. Reynolds stood motionless, his hand still clenched in a fist, a dull surprise spreading across his features. Not regret for his action, but apparent shock that he'd actually followed through on his impulse. His chest rose and fell rapidly, nostrils flaring, as if he'd run a great distance. A thin sheen of sweat had broken out on his forehead. "He got smart," Reynolds muttered, glancing around the cabin, but meeting no one's eyes, directly searching for allies and finding none. "Disrespect like that earns a lesson." The words emerged as if by rote, his father's phrase from childhood, now falling from his own lips. A woman in row 4 pressed her hands to her mouth in horror, her eyes wide above her manicured fingernails. "Oh my God! He hit a child!" She gasped the words, breaking the stunned silence and triggering a cascade of reactions throughout the cabin. An older man behind her half rose from his seat, face contorted with rage. "Someone restrain that maniac!" he called out, his voice thick with indignation. Isaiah remained crumpled against the window, blood now streaming steadily down his chin and neck, dripping onto his lap. Each breath brought a fresh wave of agony as his shattered jaw shifted. His eyes, wide shocked, brimming with tears, darted frantically around the cabin, seeking help, seeking explanation, seeking safety that had vanished in an instant of unprovoked violence. From the front row, Judge Gabriela Mendoza rose to her feet with deliberate calm. Unlike the other passengers whose reactions ranged from shock to outrage, her expression was one of controlled, focused anger. She assessed the situation with the measured gaze of someone who had witnessed human behavior at its worst in her courtroom, but was still capable of being appalled. Stepping into the aisle, she moved with purpose toward Isaiah, her eyes briefly meeting those of the businessman, shielding the boy. With a slight nod of acknowledgement, she turned to face Reynolds. "Step back," she commanded, her voice low, but carrying such natural authority that Reynolds instinctively took a step backward. "Someone call for medical assistance immediately." As the cabin erupted in chaos, passengers shouting phones, recording a junior flight attendant, radioing for emergency landing clearance. Isaiah's world narrowed to a pinpoint of pain and betrayal. The taste of blood in his mouth, the throbbing agony in his jaw, and the overwhelming question, "What did I do wrong?" It was a question that would haunt him through months of recovery therapy and legal proceedings. A question that would eventually lead not just to individual justice, but to a reckoning that would transform an entire industry. 3 days after the assault, Dr. Marcus Taylor stood at the window of Isaiah's hospital room, watching dawn break over the city. Behind him, his son slept fitfully, his jaw immobilized by surgical wiring, his face still swollen despite the gradual reduction of inflammation. The soft, rhythmic beeping of monitors provided a soundtrack to Marcus's thoughts as he methodically planned his next steps. Unlike many in his situation, Marcus wasn't operating on emotion alone. As a neurosurgeon who had spent 4 years in military medicine before joining University Hospital, he had been trained to approach even the most chaotic situations with strategic precision. That training now shaped his response to his son's assault, not in a cold, detached manner, but with focused determination that channeled his parental rage into effective action. His phone vibrated with an incoming call, the screen displaying unknown caller. Normally, Marcus would let such calls go to voicemail, but something instinct perhaps made him answer. "Dr. Taylor speaking," he said quietly, moving toward the door to avoid disturbing Isaiah. "Dr. Taylor." The voice was male, measured, professional. "My name is Richard Harlow, Senior Vice President at Altitude Airlines. I'm calling about the unfortunate incident involving your son." Marcus's grip tightened on the phone. "I'm listening. First, let me express our deepest regrets. What happened was inexcusable and goes against everything our airline stands for. We're prepared to offer immediate compensation to cover all medical expenses, pain, and suffering, plus a confidential settlement that would provide very generously for Isaiah's future education." "How generous?" Marcus asked, his voice deliberately neutral. $2 million, Dr. Taylor. Tax-free. Available immediately upon signing a standard non-disclosure agreement. We can have the paperwork to you this afternoon." Marcus stepped into the hallway, closing Isaiah's door behind him. The amount was substantial enough to fund Isaiah's entire education through medical school, if he chose that path enough to make a meaningful difference in their lives. "And what does your standard NDA entail exactly?" "Simply that you agree not to discuss the details of the incident or settlement with media or on social platforms. The case would be resolved privately, sparing Isaiah any further public attention or stress of lengthy legal proceedings." This was the moment where many would accept a guaranteed outcome without the uncertainty of litigation, immediate financial security, and protection from the public scrutiny that would inevitably accompany a high-profile case. "Mr. Harlow," Marcus said after a calculated pause. "Do you have children?" The question seemed to catch the executive off guard. Yes. 2 daughters." Then try to imagine one of them suffering a broken jaw at the hands of someone entrusted with their safety, and ask yourself if $2 million would satisfy your need for justice. "Dr. Taylor, we're not attempting to." "You're attempting to make this go away quietly." Marcus cut him off, his voice still measured, but with an edge of steel now. You're hoping to contain the damage to your corporate reputation by having me sign away my right to hold your airline fully accountable for what happened to my son. That's not. I'm declining your offer, Mr. Harlow. And I suggest you direct all future communication through my attorney, Olivia Blackwell. She'll be contacting your legal department this afternoon. Marcus ended the call and immediately dialed James Whitaker, his pulse quickening with a combination of anger and tactical focus. The airline's rapid attempt to buy silence confirmed what he had suspected. There was more to this story than one flight attendant's inexplicable assault. James, it's Marcus. I need you to accelerate our investigation into Reynolds' employment history. Altitude just tried to buy me off with $2 million and an NDA. They're scared, which means there's something there. As he spoke, Marcus noticed a nurse he didn't recognize, lingering near Isaiah's room, apparently checking her phone. When she saw him looking, she quickly moved away down the corridor. That evening, Marcus received an encrypted email from Whitaker's security breach attempt on hospital record system. Someone trying to access Isaiah's medical files. Traced back to IP address associated with firm that does contract work for Altitude. Have alerted hospital security. Watch your back. The stakes had just escalated dramatically. If Altitude was willing to attempt unauthorized access to medical records, what else might they do to protect themselves? Marcus stepped back into Isaiah's room, a new resolution forming. He wouldn't just pursue justice. He would need to create safeguards against corporate interference at every step. The next morning, Marcus arrived at Blackwell's office to find her in an unusual state of agitation. Someone broke into our case management system last night, she told him without preamble. They were specifically targeting your case files. Were they successful? No, thankfully. Our security protocols caught it, but it's concerning and telling. They're not just playing defense, Marcus. They're actively trying to undermine our case before we even file. Can we trace it? Not definitively, but our IT security consultant believes it originated from a high-end cybersecurity firm known to work with major corporations on reputation management. Her fingers made air quotes around the phrase. Marcus shared the information about the hospital records attempt and the settlement offer. Together, they began mapping out a strategy that would need to account not just for the legal battle ahead, but for apparent corporate espionage and attempts to manipulate or suppress evidence. We need to create multiple secured backups of all evidence, Marcus suggested, and perhaps feed some misleading information through channels they might be monitoring. Exactly what I was thinking. Blackwell agreed. We'll set up a parallel investigation track, one visible, that they'll inevitably discover and attempt to counter, and a deeper one that stays completely off digital systems. As they refined their approach, a breaking news alert appeared on Blackwell's monitor. Altitude Airlines announces enhanced training program following isolated incident of passenger mistreatment. They're already spinning it, Blackwell observed, scanning the press release. Characterizing Reynolds as a lone actor who failed to uphold company values while emphasizing their commitment to improvement. Classic damage control. Marcus nodded. But if they're publicly acknowledging fault while privately attempting to suppress evidence, that contradiction will become part of our case. This battle would be fought not just in the courtroom, but in the shadows. Corporate resources versus the strategic precision of a father determined to protect his son and hold accountable those who had failed him. For every move Altitude made to contain the damage, Marcus would counter with careful, methodical exposure of the systemic failures that had enabled Reynolds' assault. As he left Blackwell's office, Marcus received a text from an unknown number. Careful, Dr. Taylor. Airlines have long memories and influence in unexpected places. Consider your son's future. The message, clearly meant to intimidate, only strengthened his resolve. This wasn't just about Isaiah anymore. It was about every vulnerable passenger who had ever been mistreated, and every corporate system designed to protect those responsible rather than those harmed. The game had changed, but so had the players. Altitude was about to discover that attempting to silence a surgeon with military strategic training was a profound miscalculation. The small cafe on Chicago's north side was deliberately chosen for its anonymity, far from the hospital, the courts, and the Altitude Airlines corporate offices. Marcus Taylor arrived first, selecting a corner booth that afforded privacy while maintaining a clear view of the entrance. At precisely 2:00 p.m., Antonio Hernandez walked in, scanning the room with the watchful eyes of someone accustomed to observing passenger behavior. At 44, Hernandez carried himself with the poised confidence of a career flight attendant, though he now worked as a corporate travel coordinator. He spotted Marcus immediately and approached the table, extending his hand. "Dr. Taylor," he said, his voice carrying a slight accent. "Thank you for meeting me." Marcus gestured to the seat across from him. "Mr. Hernandez, I appreciate your willingness to come forward." The former flight attendant settled into the booth, placing a manila envelope on the table between them. His fingers trembled slightly, not with age but with unmistakable nervousness. "I saw the news about your son. The video." He shook his head, unable to complete the thought. "I should have done more years ago. Maybe this wouldn't have happened." Marcus studied him carefully. "What's troubling you, Mr. Hernandez?" Hernandez glanced around the cafe before leaning forward. "I worked with Reynolds for 3 years. I reported him 3 separate times for concerning behavior toward minority passengers. The last time, the incident that should have gotten him fired, I was told to drop it. When I didn't." He ran a hand through his salt and pepper hair. "They found reasons to write me up. Schedule violations, uniform infractions, customer complaints that mysteriously appeared in my file. They forced you out," Marcus observed. "Constructive dismissal, my lawyer called it. Made conditions so unpleasant, I had no choice but to resign." Bitterness edged his voice, but something else, too, guilt perhaps. "I gave up, took the reference letter, and walked away. And now a child has paid the price for my silence." Hernandez opened the manila envelope, extracting several documents protected in plastic sleeves. "In 2021, I witnessed an incident that crossed a line. We were on a flight from Chicago to London. A black teenager, maybe 14 or 15, was seated in first class with his parents. During meal service, the boy accidentally knocked over his water glass. Nothing unusual. Turbulence happens, spills happen." He slid the first document across the table, an incident report form dated July 17, 2021. Reynolds' reaction was completely disproportionate. He towered over the kid, berating him for carelessness and making a mess of premium cabin. When the boy tried to apologize, Reynolds grabbed his shoulder and pushed him back into his seat. Hard enough that the kid winced. Marcus examined the report, noting Hernandez's detailed description of the event, including timestamps and seat numbers. The parents complained immediately. They were professionals. I think the father was an attorney, but that's not all. Hernandez produced a second document, an email exchange between himself and a supervisor named Victoria Palmer. "I filed my own report independent of the family's complaint. I felt Reynolds' behavior constituted physical intimidation of a minor passenger." The email thread revealed a disturbing pattern. Hernandez had explicitly flagged the incident as requiring formal disciplinary action. Palmer's response was tellingly dismissive. "Antonio, we've reviewed the situation and classified it as a customer service misunderstanding. The matter has been addressed informally with the crew member in question. No further action required. In the future, please remember that crew cohesion is essential to flight safety." The family's complaint was handled separately, Hernandez explained. They received a form letter of apology and vouchers for future travel. Reynolds received no formal discipline. 2 weeks later, he was back on the schedule working first class. Marcus's expression remained neutral, but his eyes had hardened. Were there other incidents? Hernandez looked down at his hands. "Many. But there's something I haven't told you yet." He took a deep breath. "Victoria Palmer isn't just any HR director. She's my cousin by marriage." Marcus raised an eyebrow, immediately recognizing the personal complexity this added. "We were close once. She helped me get hired at Altitude. My English wasn't as good then. When I started reporting Reynolds, she called me personally off the record. Told me I was making trouble, threatening my own career. Said some passengers just needed firmer handling, and I was being too sensitive. What changed between you? The London incident. When I insisted on filing a formal report, despite her warnings, Hernandez swallowed hard. She said I was choosing strangers over family, that I'd regret it. 2 weeks later, the write-ups started. 3 months after that, I resigned. And you haven't spoken since. Christmas cards. Family gatherings we both avoid. She sends my mother gifts. He shook his head. Coming forward now. It's not just professional for me, Dr. Taylor. It's personal betrayal in her eyes. Marcus nodded slowly, understanding the multiple layers of risk Hernandez was taking. Why now, then? Why take this chance? Hernandez's eyes glistened. I have a son, too. Younger than you're 7. When I saw that video, I thought, what if that had been Miguel? What if I'd stayed silent, and it was my boy who paid the price? He straightened his shoulders. Some risks are worth taking. Some silence costs too much. The human dimension added crucial context to the corporate documents. Hernandez wasn't just a whistleblower. He was someone making an agonizing choice between family loyalty and moral responsibility, choosing the harder path at personal cost. As they continued their conversation, Hernandez revealed additional layers of Altitude's problematic practices. He described an internal classification system for passenger complaints, where incidents involving certain demographics were routinely downgraded in severity. He named specific executives who had created this system, including Victoria Palmer, who had signed off on the handling of the 2021 incident. I should warn you, Hernandez said as their meeting concluded. Victoria won't go down easily. She's ambitious, protective of the company, and now after what happened to your son, afraid. That makes her dangerous. I appreciate the warning, Marcus replied. And Mr. Hernandez, whatever happens, remember you're doing the right thing. That matters. Hernandez gathered his documents, hesitating before asking, how is your son really physically healing according to expectations? The emotional recovery is more complicated. I have a good therapist, specializes in childhood trauma. Hispanic bilingual, if that matters to your son. I could send you her information. I'd appreciate that, Marcus said, recognizing the gesture for what it was, an attempt at atonement through practical help, rather than empty sympathy. As Hernandez left, Marcus remained seated, processing the implications of what he'd learned. The pattern of negligence was clear, but now there were faces, relationships, and personal motivations attached to the corporate failures. Victoria Palmer wasn't just a name on an organizational chart. She was a person who had chosen career advancement and family loyalty over passenger safety, creating ripples of consequence that eventually reached Isaiah. Understanding these human dimensions would be crucial to dismantling the systems that had enabled Reynolds' assault. And in Antonio Hernandez, Marcus had found not just a witness, but an ally with personal stakes in seeing justice done, someone whose own healing depended on finally breaking a silence that had cost him both professionally and personally. The Taylor home fell quiet after midnight, but Isaiah wasn't asleep. He lay in his bed, surrounded by the familiar comfort of his space-themed bedroom, yet feeling strangely disconnected from it. Model airplanes hung from the ceiling on thin threads, catching moonlight through the half-open blinds. Once they had represented adventure and possibility. Now they triggered memories he was trying desperately to forget. His hand drifted unconsciously to his jaw, fingertips lightly tracing the still tender area where surgical plates now held the broken pieces together. The physical pain had subsided to a dull ache, but a different kind of hurt persisted, sharper, deeper, harder to name. Isaiah reached for the notepad he kept beside his bed, flipping to a clean page. Dr. Goldman had suggested journaling when anxiety struck at night. The wires still stabilizing his jaw made verbal expression difficult, but his thoughts could flow through pen onto paper. I keep thinking about his face. Isaiah wrote, his handwriting unusually jagged in the dim light. Not when he hit me. Before. When I asked for the juice. He looked at me like I wasn't supposed to be there. Like I was wrong just for existing in that seat. A tear splashed onto the page, blurring the ink. Isaiah wiped his eyes with his sleeve, frustrated by the emotion that still ambushed him without warning. Dad says it wasn't my fault. Dr. Goldman says it too. But if it wasn't my fault, why did it happen? The question haunted him, not just intellectually, but viscerally. His body remained on high alert, flinching at sudden movements, his heart racing when he heard authoritative voices. The world had transformed overnight from a place of reasonable safety to one of unpredictable danger. His bedroom door opened slightly, a thin beam of light cutting across the floor. Marcus appeared in the doorway, his silhouette familiar and reassuring. "I saw your light," he said softly. "Another tough night." Isaiah nodded, careful not to strain his jaw. His father entered and sat on the edge of the bed, the mattress dipping slightly under his weight. The proximity was comforting. Isaiah had found himself wanting his father closer since the assault, a regression to younger behaviors that both embarrassed and soothed him. Writing helps sometimes. Isaiah managed the words slightly slurred through his wired jaw. "May I?" Marcus gestured to the notepad. Isaiah hesitated, then handed it over, watching his father's face carefully as he read. Marcus's expression remained calm, but something flickered in his eyes, a flash of pain quickly controlled. He set the notepad down and took Isaiah's hand. His surgeon's fingers, gentle but solid. "What happened wasn't random, Isaiah. It wasn't because of anything you did or didn't do. It happened because a man with prejudice was allowed to keep his position despite previous incidents. The airline knew he was problematic and did nothing." Isaiah absorbed this, turning it over in his mind. "How do you know?" "We're finding evidence. People are coming forward." Marcus squeezed his son's hand gently. "What I'm trying to say is that while we can't undo what happened to you, we can make sure there are consequences, not just for Reynolds, but for the system that enabled him." Isaiah considered this, then scribbled on his notepad. "Will that make the nightmares stop?" The question laid bare the gap between justice and healing, between addressing the external systems and repairing the internal damage. Marcus read it and exhaled slowly, his shoulders dropping slightly. "I don't know, son. I hope it will help. But healing isn't just about what happens in courtrooms. It's about what happens here." He touched Isaiah's chest gently, and here. His hand moved to Isaiah's temple. "That's why we're working with Dr. Goldman. She has expertise I don't have, just like I have surgical skills. She doesn't. Different kinds of healing need different kinds of help." Isaiah nodded, then wrote again. "I'm scared all the time now. I hate it." "I know," Marcus said softly. "It's called hypervigilance, your brain trying to protect you from another threat. It's actually a normal response to trauma. Your body is doing what it's designed to do after a dangerous experience." "When will it stop?" Isaiah asked, the effort of speaking through his wired jaw evident. "With time and the right support. Your brain needs to relearn that most situations are safe." Marcus hesitated, then added, "I experienced something similar in Afghanistan. After a particularly bad day in the field hospital, I couldn't stop scanning for threats, couldn't relax, couldn't sleep." Isaiah's eyes widened slightly. His father rarely spoke about his military service. "What helped you?" "Therapy. Talking about it. Gradual exposure to situations that triggered anxiety. Learning techniques to calm my nervous system." Marcus smiled slightly. "Some of the same things Dr. Goldman is teaching you." This revelation that his father, who seemed so unshakable, had also struggled with fear and had found his way back to stability, shifted something in Isaiah's perception. The path ahead still seemed daunting, but less impossible, knowing someone he trusted had walked a similar road. "Dad," he asked after a moment, "will I ever want to fly again?" The question carried weight beyond the simple words it was really asking. Will I ever reclaim what was taken from me? Will the things I loved before ever feel safe again? "I believe you will," Marcus answered, careful not to offer false certainty. "Not tomorrow, not next week, but eventually. And when you're ready, I'll be right beside you." Isaiah nodded, then reached for a model airplane that sat on his nightstand, a detailed replica of a Boeing 787 Dreamliner that had once been his favorite. He hadn't touched it since returning from the hospital. Now he held it tentatively, turning it over in his hands, examining it with cautious re-engagement rather than instinctive avoidance. It was a small gesture, imperceptible to anyone who hadn't witnessed Isaiah's previous inability to even look at images of aircraft. But to Marcus, it represented a crucial first step, his son beginning the delicate process of reclaiming what trauma had stolen from him. "Try the breathing exercise Dr. Goldman showed us," Marcus suggested gently. "I'll do it with you." Together they practiced the rhythmic breathing pattern. 4 counts in hold for 7, exhale for 8. The simple physiological intervention gradually slowing Isaiah's heart rate, easing the tension in his shoulders, sending signals of safety to his hypervigilant nervous system. As Isaiah's eyelids finally grew heavy, Marcus remained beside him, a steady presence against the darker currents of memory and fear. The healing journey ahead would not be linear. There would be setbacks, nightmares, moments of progress, followed by unexpected triggers. But in this quiet moment of connection, father and son had established something essential. They would navigate this path together, combining Marcus's determination to secure justice with an equally important commitment to Isaiah's internal healing. This dual focus, addressing both the external systems that had failed and the internal wounds they had created, would ultimately define their approach to everything that followed. The downtown law offices of Wilson Legal Services occupied half of the 15th floor in an aging office building, respectable but modest compared to the gleaming high-rise headquarters of Blackwell and Associates. In a conference room with a view of the elevated train tracks, Brian Reynolds sat rigidly across from his attorney Grant Wilson, reviewing preparation materials for his upcoming plea hearing. Remember when Judge Washington asks if you understand the charges, you respond clearly and directly. Wilson instructed, his tone professional, but tinged with the weariness of a public defender who had seen too many clients face the consequences of their actions. Simple, "Yes, Your Honor," responses. No explanations or justifications unless specifically asked. Reynolds nodded, his once confident demeanor diminished by weeks of legal proceedings and the stark reality of his situation. His Altitude Airlines uniform had been replaced by a conservative Navy suit that seemed to hang loosely on his frame, as if he had physically shrunk under the weight of his circumstances. "And you're certain this is the best we can do?" Reynolds asked, gesturing to the plea agreement documents spread between them. 3 to 5 years still seems excessive for a momentary lapse in judgment. Wilson removed his reading glasses, pinching the bridge of his nose before responding. "Brian, we've been over this. You're pleading guilty to aggravated battery of a minor, a felony that carries a potential 7-year sentence. The DA dropped the hate crime enhancement, which would have pushed the maximum to 10 years. Given the evidence against you, including multiple videos and a federal judge as eyewitness, this is an extremely favorable outcome." Reynolds' jaw tightened, a flash of the same rigid righteousness that had characterized his interaction with Isaiah briefly visible before he suppressed it. Then, unexpectedly, his shoulders slumped and he covered his face with his hands. "I keep seeing his face," he said, his voice muffled. "The boy. The moment after I hit him. The blood. The confusion in his eyes." Wilson sat back, surprised by this first genuine display of remorse. "You've never mentioned that before." Reynolds lowered his hands, his eyes reddened. "Because I've been trying not to think about it. Trying to focus on defense strategies, explanations, justifications." He shook his head slowly. "But I did it. I hit a child who did nothing wrong except politely point out that I'd lied about the juice." "What's changed?" Brian Wilson asked carefully. "I received a letter. From my sister." Reynolds reached into his jacket pocket and removed a folded piece of paper. "She has a son, my nephew. Mixed race, 10 years old." Wilson waited as Reynolds unfolded the letter with trembling hands. She wrote, "I've watched that video a dozen times trying to understand how my own brother could do such a thing. Trying to imagine how I would feel if that had been Elijah in that seat. I can't reconcile the brother I thought I knew with the man in that video. Until you can truly understand the horror of what you did, please don't contact us." The words hung in the air between them. For the first time since they had begun working together, Wilson saw past the defensive posturing to the human complexity beneath a man beginning to grasp the full weight of his actions through the lens of family connection. "I've lost everything," Reynolds continued quietly. "My career, my reputation, now my family. And for what? Because a black child dared to sit in first class and ask for juice." He looked up, meeting Wilson's eyes directly. "What does that say about me?" It was the question Wilson had been waiting for, the first indication that Reynolds was moving beyond self-protection toward genuine self-reflection. "It says you have biases you never confronted," he replied carefully. "Biases that festered until they exploded into violence." Reynolds nodded slowly. "I grew up hearing my father talk about how certain people were getting advantages while hard-working people like us struggled. I never thought of myself as prejudiced. I told myself I was just maintaining standards, enforcing rules. But when I look at what I did, this recognition is important, Brian. Not just for your plea statement, but for your rehabilitation. Understanding why you acted as you did is the first step toward ensuring you never do anything like this again." As they continued preparing for the plea hearing, Reynolds' attitude shifted subtly. The focus moved from strategic self-presentation toward a more honest reckoning, still self-interested in seeking the most favorable sentencing outcome, but now tinged with genuine remorse and dawning self-awareness. Later, alone in his apartment, Reynolds sat at his small kitchen table, attempting to write his statement to the court. The airline had terminated his employment immediately after the incident. His savings were depleted by legal fees. The future loomed as a bleak landscape of imprisonment, followed by the permanent stigma of a felony conviction. Yet strangely, his thoughts kept returning not to his own circumstances, but to Isaiah Taylor, to the hospital bed, where the boy had spent weeks with his jaw wired shut to the pain and fear his violence had inflicted, to the childhood innocence he had shattered in a moment of uncontrolled rage. He reached for a framed photograph himself, in his freshly issued Altitude Airlines uniform, 12 years earlier, proud and eager to begin his career. What had happened to that younger self, who had genuinely wanted to provide excellent service to all passengers? When had standards and rules become weapons rather than guidelines? When had his father's prejudices become so deeply internalized that he no longer recognized them as such? Reynolds set the photo down and began writing again, this time from a place of painful honesty, rather than strategic self-presentation. "Your Honor, there are no words that can adequately express my remorse for what I did to Isaiah Taylor. My actions were inexcusable. A child asked me for juice, and I responded with violence that broke his jaw and caused trauma that will affect him for years to come. I've had to confront uncomfortable truths about myself, biases I denied, but acted upon arrogance. I justified as professionalism and anger. I allowed to build until it exploded towards someone completely innocent. The hardest truth is recognizing that what I did wasn't a momentary lapse, but the culmination of attitudes I had harbored and acted upon in smaller ways for years. I don't ask for leniency. I ask only for the opportunity to use whatever sentence I receive to begin the process of understanding and addressing the prejudices that led me to cause such harm to a child who deserved only the kindness and protection any young person should expect from adults in positions of authority." He set down his pen, the words on the page representing not just a strategic plea for judicial mercy, but the beginning of a more painful process, confronting the man he had allowed himself to become, and the damage that man had caused. The complexity of human change meant this newfound awareness didn't erase his fear of imprisonment or his hope for the minimum possible sentence. But alongside those self-interested concerns, now existed something new, the fragile beginnings of genuine remorse, and the uncomfortable recognition that justice in this case required substantial consequences for his actions. In the morning, he would share this statement with Wilson, who would likely suggest strategic revisions to maximize its impact on sentencing. But for tonight alone with his conscience, Reynolds sat with the unvarnished truth of what he had done and the long, difficult path that lay ahead if he truly wanted to become someone incapable of such violence. The courtroom fell into a reverent hush as Isaiah Taylor approached the witness stand. At 11 years old, his physical stature seemed diminished by the formal wooden chair and the solemn architecture surrounding him. Yet there was a quiet dignity in his careful movements. The surgical scars along his jawline were barely visible now, but the psychological impact of the assault remained evident in his watchful eyes and the way he scanned the room before settling into his seat, his heart hammered against his ribs, each beat thundering in his ears. The breathing techniques Dr. Goldman had taught him seemed suddenly inadequate against the wave of anxiety threatening to overwhelm him. His palms were slick with sweat, and the small comfort object in his pocket, a smooth stone Dr. Goldman had given him as an anchor, felt impossibly heavy. Isaiah's eyes found his father in the front row. Marcus gave an almost imperceptible nod of reassurance, their private signal that had come to mean, "I see you. I'm here. You're safe." Judge Washington leaned forward slightly, his manner gentler than it had been with adult witnesses. "Isaiah, do you understand what it means to tell the truth in court?" "Yes, Your Honor," Isaiah replied, his voice wavering slightly before he steadied it with conscious effort. "It means saying what really happened, even if it's hard to talk about or makes people uncomfortable." "That's right." The judge nodded approvingly. "And do you understand that you've taken an oath to tell the truth?" "Yes, sir." "Very good. Ms. Blackwell will ask you some questions now." Olivia Blackwell approached the witness stand, maintaining a respectful distance that Dr. Goldman had suggested would help Isaiah feel more comfortable. Her usually commanding courtroom presence softened noticeably, though she was careful to avoid the condescending tone adults sometimes unconsciously adopt with children. "Thank you for being here today, Isaiah," she began. "I know this isn't easy. Could you tell us a little about yourself? What grade you're in? What subjects you enjoy in school?" This gentle introduction, designed to help Isaiah acclimate to the courtroom environment, brought a small but genuine smile to his face. "I'm in 6th grade now. I like science best, especially anything about airplanes and flight. And I play basketball in a league at the community center." "Before what happened on the airplane, had you flown before?" "Yes, lots of times with my parents." Isaiah's hand drifted unconsciously to his jaw, a gesture that several jurors noticed. "But that was my first time flying by myself to visit my grandmother in Atlanta." "How did you feel about flying alone?" Isaiah's expression grew thoughtful. "I was excited. My dad had helped me prepare. We went over the safety rules, what to do during takeoff and landing. I had my unaccompanied minor tag, and I knew to be extra polite to the flight attendants since I was representing my family." This simple statement, delivered without any apparent awareness of its poignancy, visibly affected several jurors. The contrast between Isaiah's careful preparation and the treatment he had received underscored the betrayal of trust at the heart of the case. With patient questioning, Blackwell guided Isaiah through the events on Flight 2703, his assignment to first class, his initial interactions with other passengers and crew, and finally, the fateful exchange with Brian Reynolds. "Could you tell us what happened when you asked for apple juice?" Blackwell prompted gently. Isaiah's posture tensed slightly, but his voice remained steady. "I pressed the call button because my cup had spilled during takeoff. When Mr. Reynolds came, I asked politely for more apple juice. He said they were out, but I could see the menu said they had it, and I'd seen him give juice to someone else just before." "What did you say when you noticed this?" "I just said, 'Excuse me, sir, but the menu says you have apple juice.' I wasn't being rude. My mom always taught me to be respectful to adults, especially when traveling." "How did Mr. Reynolds respond?" Isaiah's eyes dropped briefly to his hands. He got really angry. His face changed like twisted up. He said I was talking back and that I didn't belong in first class. His voice got all tight, and he was standing really close to me. I could feel his breath on my face. Isaiah's hand went to the smooth stone in his pocket, squeezing it as he continued. I didn't understand what I'd done wrong. I just kept thinking maybe I'd said the words wrong, or used the wrong tone, even though I was being careful to be polite like Mom taught me. What happened next, Isaiah? There was a brief pause as Isaiah gathered himself. Dr. Goldman, seated in the gallery, gave him an encouraging nod. He hit me, Isaiah said, his voice dropping to near a whisper before he consciously strengthened it. Really hard right here. He indicated his jaw. I heard something crack inside my head, and then my mouth filled with blood. I couldn't move my jaw to talk or call for help. The stark simplicity of his description, devoid of dramatic embellishment, carried profound emotional impact throughout the courtroom. Several jurors visibly winced. One older woman dabbed at her eyes with a tissue. What do you remember after being hit? Everything got kind of blurry, like when you're underwater and try to see things above the surface. I remember Judge Mendoza coming to help me and then paramedics. The hospital was scary. They had to wire my jaw shut after surgery. I couldn't talk or eat solid food for weeks. Isaiah swallowed hard, his composure momentarily slipping. The worst part wasn't even the pain, though. It was... He stopped struggling. Take your time, Blackwell said gently. It was not understanding why Isaiah continued, his voice steadier now. Why someone whose job was to help passengers would hurt me when I didn't do anything wrong. It made me feel like the world doesn't make sense anymore, like bad things can happen for no reason, even when you follow all the rules. This insight, profound in its childlike directness, seemed to affect the jury even more deeply than the physical description of his injuries. It captured the psychological damage of the assault, the shattering of a child's fundamental trust in adult authority, and the ordered world they represent. Blackwell guided Isaiah through the physical recovery process before addressing the emotional impact. How did this experience affect you besides the physical injuries? I had really bad nightmares, Isaiah admitted. I still do sometimes. I'm scared in crowded places. I missed a lot of school. And... He hesitated, looking toward his father for reassurance before continuing. I was afraid to fly again, which made me really sad because I've always loved airplanes. I want to be a pilot someday. How are you working through these feelings? Dr. Goldman helps me. We practice coping strategies like breathing techniques and grounding exercises. She says my brain is trying to protect me by staying on high alert, but I can teach it that most situations are safe now. Isaiah's voice took on a note of determination. I'm getting better, but it's hard work. Some days are good and some aren't. Isaiah, what would you like the jury to understand most about your experience? Isaiah considered this carefully, his expression serious beyond his years. I want them to know that when something like this happens, it doesn't just hurt your body. It changes how you see the world. Before, I trusted adults in uniforms to help keep me safe. Now I have to work really hard not to be afraid when I see someone in a uniform. He took a deep breath, centering himself the way Dr. Goldman had taught him. But I also want them to know I'm not giving up. I'm still going to be a pilot someday. It might take longer now, but I'm not letting what happened take that away from me. This declaration of resilience, coming from a child who had endured such trauma, created a palpable emotional current in the courtroom. Even Michael Brennan, Altitude's attorney, seemed momentarily affected, glancing down at his notes rather than maintaining his usual composed expression. Brennan approached cross-examination with appropriate caution, aware that aggressive questioning of a child witness would alienate the jury. His primary objective appeared to be minimizing damage rather than challenging Isaiah's account. Isaiah, first let me say how sorry I am for what happened to you, Brennan began. No child should ever experience what you did. I just have a few brief questions to clarify some details. He proceeded with gentle, factual questions about the sequence of events, careful to avoid any implication that Isaiah had provoked the assault or behaved inappropriately. Rather than attempting to undermine Isaiah's testimony, Brennan seemed focused on reinforcing the distinction between Reynolds' individual actions and broader airline policy. Before this incident with Mr. Reynolds, had any other Altitude Airlines employees treated you disrespectfully during the flight? No, sir. The gate agent who helped me board was really nice. And after Mr. Reynolds struck you, did the other flight attendant who came to help seem shocked by what had happened? Yes. She looked really surprised and scared. She called for help right away. As Brennan concluded his questioning, Isaiah visibly relaxed, the ordeal of testimony nearly complete. Judge Washington addressed him directly. Isaiah, you've shown remarkable courage today. Thank you for your honest answers. You may step down now. Isaiah carefully descended from the witness stand, maintaining his composure until he reached his father. As Marcus placed a supportive arm around his shoulders, a small, almost imperceptible tremor ran through the boy's frame. The release of tension held too long, the momentary dropping of a brave face maintained at considerable cost. You did it, Marcus whispered, pride evident in his voice despite the low volume. Can we go home now? Isaiah asked suddenly, sounding much younger than the composed witness of moments before. Yes. Dr. Goldman is waiting to take you. I'll be there as soon as court adjourns for the day. As Isaiah left with his therapist, Marcus returned to his seat, his expression reflecting both pride in his son's courage and a renewed determination to see justice done, not just for Isaiah, but for every child whose safety depended on systems that had failed his son, but might yet be transformed through the pursuit of meaningful accountability. The packed courtroom hummed with anticipation as both legal teams made final preparations for closing arguments. After 3 weeks of testimony, evidence presentation, and expert analysis, the case that had begun with a single violent act had expanded to encompass issues of corporate culture, systematic discrimination, and institutional accountability. Judge Washington addressed the courtroom with customary precision. We will now hear closing arguments. As a reminder, these statements are not evidence, but rather the attorney's final opportunity to explain how they believe the evidence supports their case. Ms. Blackwell, you may proceed. Olivia Blackwell rose her measured steps to the podium, reflecting the gravity of the moment. Throughout the trial, she had maintained a careful balance between passionate advocacy and methodical legal reasoning. Now, in her closing argument, these elements would need to coalesce into a compelling narrative that connected the mountain of evidence to the fundamental question of corporate responsibility. Your Honor, members of the jury. She began, her voice clear and resolute. This case began with a single moment of inexcusable violence. A flight attendant striking a child with enough force to shatter his jaw because the boy politely requested apple juice that was available but had been arbitrarily denied to him. She paused, allowing the stark simplicity of this fact to resonate. But as you have seen through 3 weeks of testimony and evidence, that moment of violence didn't occur in isolation. It wasn't a random aberration that no one could have anticipated. It was the predictable culmination of a pattern that Altitude Airlines was not only aware of, but actively worked to suppress. Blackwell methodically reviewed the key evidence. The 11 documented complaints about Reynolds' discriminatory treatment of minority passengers, the 2021 London flight incident, where he had physically intimidated a child, Maria Gonzalez's persistent warnings and subsequent reassignment, and the internal classification system that systematically minimized complaints from certain passenger demographics. The defense would have you believe that Reynolds was a rogue employee whose actions couldn't have been foreseen. But the evidence tells a different story, of an airline that received explicit warnings about Reynolds' escalating behavior, including physical intimidation of a minor passenger, yet not only failed to take appropriate action, but actively suppressed these warnings by reassigning the supervisor who raised them. She displayed a timeline connecting specific executive decisions to the conditions that enabled Reynolds' behavior to continue unchecked. This isn't about whether Altitude Airlines intended for Isaiah to be injured. It's about whether they created conditions where such an injury became increasingly probable through deliberate policy decisions, systematic suppression of warnings, and a corporate culture that valued certain passengers' experiences over others' safety. Blackwell concluded by returning to the human impact at the center of the case. Isaiah Taylor boarded that flight as a 10-year-old, excited for his first solo trip, carefully following his parents' instructions to be polite and respectful. He left with a shattered jaw, enduring months of physical pain and psychological trauma, that continues to affect him today. His suffering was not inevitable. It was preventable. If only Altitude Airlines had listened to the warnings they received and prioritized passenger safety over the protection of a problematic employee. As Blackwell returned to the plaintiff's table, Michael Brennan rose to present the defense's closing argument. Throughout the trial, his strategy had evolved in response to the mounting evidence against Altitude, shifting from complete denial of responsibility to a more nuanced position, acknowledging institutional shortcomings while still arguing against full liability. "Your Honor, members of the jury," Brennan began, his tone measured and thoughtful. "What happened to Isaiah Taylor was unconscionable, and no one, certainly not Altitude Airlines, disputes that Brian Reynolds bears primary responsibility for his violent actions. Reynolds has rightly been held accountable in criminal court for his assault on an innocent child." Brennan acknowledged certain facts that had been irrefutably established during trial, while attempting to reframe their significance. Yes, there were previous complaints about Reynolds. Yes, certain institutional processes for handling those complaints proved inadequate. But the question before you is whether these organizational shortcomings rise to the level of legal liability for an employee's criminal act that violated every standard of conduct he was trained to uphold. He emphasized the airline's formal policies, prohibiting discrimination and physical contact with passengers, the comprehensive training all flight attendants received, and the impossibility of predicting when an employee might suddenly violate these established standards. In a company with over 12,000 flight attendants serving millions of passengers annually, perfection in oversight is an aspirational goal rather than a reasonable expectation. The law recognizes this reality by establishing a standard of reasonable care rather than perfect prevention. As Brennan concluded, the contrasting narratives were clear. Blackwell portrayed the assault as the predictable outcome of systematic failures that the airline had been warned about, but chose to ignore, while Brennan characterized it as an unforeseeable criminal act that occurred despite reasonable institutional safeguards. Judge Washington provided detailed instructions to the jury on the applicable legal standards, explaining the concepts of negligence, foreseeability, and corporate liability with careful precision. After addressing several procedural matters, he sent the jury to begin deliberations. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, you have heard all the evidence and arguments in this case. It is now your responsibility to determine whether Altitude Airlines bears legal liability for the injuries suffered by Isaiah Taylor, and if so, to what extent. Your deliberations should be thorough and thoughtful, considering all testimony and evidence presented during trial." As the jury filed out, the courtroom remained unusually still. Marcus Taylor sat beside Blackwell at the plaintiff's table, his expression reflective rather than triumphant, despite the strong case they had presented. Throughout the trial, he had maintained focus on the broader purpose beyond financial compensation, driving meaningful change in how airlines handled passenger safety and discrimination concerns. The first day of jury deliberations passed without a verdict. Then a second. By the third morning, tension in the courtroom had increased noticeably. Legal observers had expected a relatively swift decision, given the strength of the evidence presented, and the extended deliberation suggested potential disagreement among jurors. Late that afternoon, a message came from the jury room. They were deadlocked on a key question of corporate liability. Judge Washington called the attorneys to his chambers for a private conference. "The jury foreman has informed me they're split on whether Altitude's failures rise to the level of legal liability for Reynolds' assault," he explained. "I'm considering providing additional instructions to help them work through this impasse." Blackwell and Brennan each presented arguments for specific clarifications, and Judge Washington crafted a supplementary instruction emphasizing the concept of foreseeability in corporate negligence cases. "Ladies and gentlemen," he told the reconvened jury, "in determining whether Altitude Airlines bears legal responsibility, consider whether the evidence shows that the airline knew or should have known that Reynolds posed a potential risk to passengers based on his documented behavior patterns, and whether they took reasonable steps to address that risk." The jury returned to deliberations with renewed focus. 3 hours later, the courtroom bailiff announced they had reached a verdict. As the jurors filed in, their expressions gave nothing away. The foreman, a middle-aged woman who had taken meticulous notes throughout the trial, handed the verdict form to the court clerk with steady hands. After reviewing the document, Judge Washington returned it to the clerk for reading. In the matter of Taylor v. Altitude Airlines, on the claim of negligence, the jury finds in favor of the plaintiff. A ripple of reaction moved through the courtroom, quickly silenced by the judge's sharp glance. On the question of corporate liability for the actions of employee Brian Reynolds, the jury finds that Altitude Airlines bears substantial responsibility based on their failure to address known concerns about his behavior. The clerk continued reading the detailed findings, which addressed specific elements of the plaintiff's claims about systematic failures in complaint handling, employee supervision, and corporate culture. On virtually every substantive point, the jury had found in favor of the plaintiff. On the matter of compensatory damages, the jury awards the plaintiff $4.8 million for medical expenses, pain and suffering, and ongoing psychological care. This substantial but not excessive amount reflected the jury's careful consideration of the evidence regarding Isaiah's injuries and their long-term impact. However, it was the next part of the verdict that sent a clear message about corporate accountability. On the matter of punitive damages intended to deter similar conduct in the future, the jury awards $12 million. The punitive award, significantly larger than the compensatory damages, represented the jury's determination that Altitude's systematic failures warranted substantial financial consequences beyond mere compensation for Isaiah's injuries. Marcus closed his eyes briefly, his hand tightening on the edge of the table, not in triumph, but in vindication. The verdict wasn't just about money. It was formal recognition that what happened to Isaiah wasn't simply one man's inexplicable violence, but the product of systematic failures that could and should have been prevented. Across the aisle, several Altitude executives sat in stunned silence. The verdict amount exceeded even their worst-case projections, and the specific findings regarding corporate knowledge and negligence opened potential liability far beyond this single case. As the verdict reading concluded, Judge Washington addressed the courtroom. The jury has spoken. This court extends its appreciation for your careful attention throughout this complex case. A written order incorporating these findings will be issued within 14 days. In the moments following adjournment, the courtroom erupted in subdued conversations. Marcus embraced Olivia Blackwell, their shared goal of establishing meaningful accountability achieved beyond what either had initially thought possible. The verdict's message was clear, not just in the financial awards, but in the specific findings about corporate responsibility that would establish important precedent for future cases. Outside the courthouse, where media had gathered in anticipation of the verdict, Marcus made a brief statement while declining to answer specific questions. Today's verdict isn't about money, he said, his voice steady, despite the emotion of the moment. It's about accountability and change. Isaiah and I hope this outcome will help ensure that no other child experiences what he did, not just on Altitude Airlines, but throughout an industry that now has clear notice that passenger safety must take priority over protecting problematic employees or preserving comfortable fictions about corporate responsibility. As cameras flashed and reporters called out questions, Marcus caught sight of Antonio Hernandez, standing at the edge of the crowd, a quiet witness to the culmination of a process his testimony had helped set in motion. Their eyes met briefly, a moment of shared understanding between two men who had risked different things in pursuit of the same justice. Marcus nodded once in acknowledgement before turning away from the microphones. The legal battle had been won, but the more important victory lay ahead in the industry-wide changes this precedent might inspire, and in Isaiah's continued journey toward healing and reclaiming what violence had threatened to take from him. The gleaming glass doors of the newly completed Isaiah Taylor Safe Lounge at O'Hare International Airport slid open, revealing a space transformed from institutional functionality into a haven specifically designed for young travelers. Gone were the sterile waiting areas and intimidating signage, replaced by comfortable seating, arranged in conversational groupings, interactive displays about flight and travel, and walls adorned with vibrant murals depicting diverse children embarking on adventures around the world. 1 year to the day after the verdict that had established accountability for his assault, Isaiah Taylor stood before a small gathering of aviation officials, child safety advocates, and families of young travelers. At 12 years old, he had grown several inches taller since that fateful flight, his physical presence stronger, his bearing more confident, despite the lingering awareness that still occasionally shadowed his eyes. His hands trembled slightly as he unfolded the note cards containing his prepared remarks. Public speaking still triggered his anxiety, but Dr. Goldman had helped him develop strategies to manage it, focusing on friendly faces in the audience, using grounding techniques, remembering that temporary discomfort didn't equal danger. He found his father's eyes in the front row and drew strength from the unwavering support he saw there. "Welcome to the safe lounge." Isaiah began, his voice initially soft, but gaining strength as he continued. "A year ago, I wasn't sure I'd ever want to fly again. Today I'm standing in an airport and talking about how excited I am for my trip to aviation camp next month." He gestured to the specially designed features of the lounge, the quiet rooms where overwhelmed children could decompress, the trained staff available to provide support, the clear sight lines that allowed young travelers to maintain visual awareness of their surroundings, the age-appropriate information about rights and resources available during travel. "This space exists because a lot of adults listened and took action," Isaiah explained. "They understood that feeling safe isn't just about being physically okay, it's about being treated with respect and knowing that someone will help if you need it." As he continued his remarks, Isaiah found himself departing from his prepared text, speaking more directly from his experience than he had initially planned. The hardest part, after what happened, wasn't even the physical pain. He said, one hand unconsciously touching his jaw where the surgical plates remained. It was feeling like the world suddenly made no sense, like following the rules and being polite didn't protect you after all. The room had gone completely still, adults and children alike, captured by the simple eloquence of a boy speaking his truth without self-pity or dramatic flourish. For a while I was angry all the time, not just at the person who hurt me, but at the whole system that let it happen. I didn't understand how adults could know someone might be dangerous and still let them work with children. In the front row, Marcus Taylor felt a swell of emotion, pride in his son's courage, mixed with renewed grief for the innocence that had been irretrievably lost. Beside him sat Judge Gabriela Mendoza, whose presence on Flight 2703 had provided crucial testimony, and whose subsequent advocacy had helped shape the regulatory reforms that now protected vulnerable travelers throughout the system. "But being angry all the time is exhausting," Isaiah continued, a small smile now softening his expression. "And it doesn't fix anything. What does help is turning bad experiences into something that prevents other kids from going through the same thing." He indicated the safe lounge around them, one of 12 such facilities now established at major airports across the country as part of the settlement agreement and subsequent industry reforms. "The most important thing I want other kids to know," Isaiah concluded, his gaze sweeping the audience with surprising poise, "is that if something bad happens, it's not your fault, and you're not alone. It's okay to be scared. It's okay to need help, and it's okay to take time to feel better. But with the right support, you can find your way back to the things you love." As applause filled the room, Isaiah caught sight of an unexpected face in the audience. Antonio Hernandez, the former flight attendant, whose testimony had been crucial in establishing Altitude's prior knowledge of Reynolds' concerning behavior. Their eyes met across the room, and Hernandez gave a small nod of respect and something that looked like gratitude. After the formal ribbon-cutting ceremony concluded, Isaiah found himself approached by a woman and a young boy who appeared to be about 9 years old. "Isaiah, I'm Elena Ruiz, and this is my son Miguel." The woman extended her hand, We wanted to thank you personally. Miguel was scheduled to fly alone last month, and he was terrified after hearing about what happened to you. But when we came to this lounge for his pre-flight orientation, it changed everything. The boy looked up at Isaiah with undisguised admiration. They showed us all the safety measures and gave me an emergency contact bracelet and taught me what to do if I ever feel unsafe. I wasn't scared anymore when I actually got on the plane. Isaiah knelt slightly to meet Miguel at eye level. Was your flight okay? Miguel nodded enthusiastically. It was awesome. The flight attendant gave me an extra dessert and showed me the cockpit before landing. I want to be a pilot too. The simple exchange. One child who had experienced trauma helping another overcome fear embodied the deeper purpose behind everything Marcus and Isaiah had fought for throughout the legal battle. Not just punishment for wrongdoing, not just financial compensation, but systemic change that created genuine safety and restored possibilities that might otherwise have been lost to fear. As the gathering dispersed, Isaiah rejoined his father near the expansive windows overlooking the runways, where aircraft of various sizes taxied, took off, and landed in carefully choreographed patterns. For several moments, they stood in comfortable silence, watching the planes with shared appreciation, rather than the anxiety that had previously accompanied such scenes. "Proud of you, Champ," Marcus said simply, placing a hand on his son's shoulder. Isaiah nodded his gaze, still following a Boeing 787, as it lifted gracefully into the afternoon sky. "Do you think it made a difference?" he asked after a moment. "All of this, the trial, the changes this place," Marcus considered the question with the thoughtfulness it deserved. In the year since the verdict, they had witnessed substantive reforms throughout the aviation industry. Enhanced training requirements, improved complaint handling procedures, independent oversight mechanisms, and dedicated resources for vulnerable travelers. Reynolds was serving his sentence. Altitude Airlines had transformed its approach to passenger safety and dignity, and regulatory frameworks had been strengthened to prevent similar failures in the future. Yet, beneath these concrete changes lay something more profound: a shift in understanding about responsibility, accountability, and the fundamental right of every traveler, particularly the most vulnerable, to be treated with respect and protected from harm. "Yes," Marcus answered finally. "It made a difference, not just in rules and procedures, but in how people think about what's acceptable and what isn't. And most importantly, it made a difference for you not erasing what happened, but giving it meaning beyond just pain." Isaiah nodded, his expression reflective. "I still get scared sometimes," he admitted, "but I'm not letting what happened stop me from becoming who I want to be." As they prepared to leave, Isaiah paused for one last look at the aircraft rising into the sky beyond the windows. The same sight that had once triggered panic, now reclaimed as a source of fascination and possibility. In that moment, watching his son's face illuminate with genuine enthusiasm rather than fear, Marcus recognized that they had indeed come full circle, not back to where they had been before the assault, for that innocence could never be fully recovered, but forward to a new place of strength, wisdom, and purpose that transcended the trauma they had navigated together. "Dad," Isaiah said suddenly, "there's something I need to do before we go." He led his father back into the safe lounge, to a wall where children were being invited to write messages on colorful paper planes that would become part of an art installation. Isaiah took a marker and carefully wrote on a bright blue plane, "Being brave isn't about not being scared. It's about doing important things even when you are scared." He added his initials, IT, and pinned the plane to the wall alongside dozens of others, each carrying messages of hope, courage, and adventure. As father and son finally departed, their steps were neither burdened by the weight of unresolved trauma nor artificially lightened by false closure. Instead, they moved with the authentic, measured pace of those who had confronted a profound injustice, pursued accountability with dignity and determination, and emerged not unchanged, but undefeated. Their relationship strengthened, their understanding deepened, and their commitment to creating meaningful change from painful experience firmly established as part of their shared journey forward. Behind them, in the Isaiah Taylor Safe Lounge, a new group of young travelers was arriving, children who would never know the fear and pain that had led to the creation of this space, but who would benefit from the protections and respect it represented. And on the wall, Isaiah's blue paper airplane seemed to soar among the others, carrying its message of resilience to all who might need it in the skies ahead. If this story moved you, please hit the like button and subscribe to our channel. Share this video with others who need to understand how systemic change happens when we refuse to accept injustice. Your support helps us continue bringing these important stories to light. Remember, one voice speaking truth can transform not just individual lives, but entire industries. Join our community today and be part of the change.